The last story gives me chills just thinking about it. Camping with friends in the heart of the mountains was supposed to be a way to escape the city, relax, and lose ourselves in nature. We set up camp deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town or paved road. Out there, the silence was thick, the air crisp, and the stars vast and endless above us. It was perfect, right until it wasn't. That night, we were sitting around the fire, swapping stories, and letting the warmth seep into our bones when a strange howl echoed through the trees. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It started low, rumbling up from somewhere deep, and then rose to a high-pitched, warbling wail that cut through the night air. I felt the hair on my arms stand up, a shiver running through me. My friends went silent, all of us glancing around with unease. "Probably just a coyote," one of them mumbled, but his voice didn't have much confidence behind it. The howl sounded again, closer this time, but stranger. It almost seemed human, as if someone was mimicking an animal call, but not quite getting it right. The laughter and banter were gone now. We sat quietly, straining to hear anything out of place, but all we caught was the faint crackling of the fire and the wind rustling through the trees. We tried to shake it off, laughing nervously, though none of us felt like ourselves. As the night stretched on, the silence deepened, and an odd sense of dread hung over us. Every so often we'd hear the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, as if something was moving just beyond the firelight. I kept telling myself it was nothing, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but my heart pounded every time a new sound broke the quiet. Finally, one of my friends pointed, his face drained of color. "What's that?" he stammered, barely loud enough to be heard. I followed his gaze, squinting into the shadows, and felt my blood go cold. Just beyond the trees, a figure was standing, half hidden in shadow. At first, I thought it was another person, maybe even one of my friends playing a trick. But as I looked closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. The figure had a human shape, but its limbs were too long and too thin, like something had stretched them beyond what was natural. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the light of our fire in a sickly yellow hue. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel those eyes on me, like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then it spoke. The voice was soft, whispery, and disturbingly familiar. It was my own voice, but twisted, hollow, and empty. "Come closer," it murmured, beckoning with one long, spindly finger. "Come see." I stumbled back, tripping over a log and sprawling onto the ground. My friends rushed over, pulling me up, and together we bolted, leaving the fire, our gear, everything behind. As we ran, I heard a distorted laugh echoing through the trees, a sound that shouldn't have come from any living creature. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, our breaths coming in panicked gasps. I didn't look back, didn't dare, but I could feel that thing watching us, its gaze heavy and lingering even as we fled. To this day, I can still hear that voice in my nightmares, whispering my own words back at me, inviting me into the shadows. This next story still gives me chills to this day. Like and subscribe. It was an October evening, the crisp fall air carrying the faint smell of decaying leaves and pine as my cousin and I trekked into the woods to camp by a secluded lake. We'd camped there several times before, and it had always been peaceful, untouched by civilization, its beauty rivaling anything I'd ever seen. But something about that night felt wrong. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, and even the birds seemed quieter than usual. The lake was like glass, perfectly still as we set up camp, the water reflecting the dense mist that settled over it as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the time we'd built our fire and cooked a small meal, the mist had thickened, curling around the trees and hiding everything more than a few feet beyond the fire's glow. I should have felt at ease, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of nature, but instead, a strange sense of dread settled over me. It was nearly midnight when I first heard it. A faint rustling came from the trees behind us, followed by a soft, shuffling sound. I brushed it off as a small animal moving through the underbrush. but when I listened closely, I could hear something else. A rhythmic tapping, like footsteps. My cousin sat across the fire, his face relaxed, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dark. I heard the footsteps again, slow and deliberate, as if something was circling our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees, the beam cutting through the mist, but revealing nothing beyond the twisted branches and tangled undergrowth. Still, I couldn't ignore the creeping feeling in my chest, the sense that we weren't alone out there. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard my cousin's voice, faint and distant. "Come here," it called, drifting through the trees like a whisper on the wind. "I've found something." I glanced at my cousin, but he was still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with a puzzled expression. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a cold chill settle over me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He looked up at me, his face pale and confused. "Hear what?" I hesitated, my eyes darting toward the darkness. Before I could respond, the voice called again, louder this time, more insistent. "Come here," it said, the words echoing strangely in the still night air. It sounded exactly like my cousin's voice, down to the slight drawl. But something about it felt wrong. There was an edge to it, a coldness that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my cousin's arm, holding him close to the fire. We sat there in silence, too terrified to move, listening as the voice continued to call out, each time sounding angrier, more desperate. My cousin's grip tightened on my arm, and I could feel his pulse racing, matching my own. We both knew it wasn't him calling out there in the darkness, but neither of us could bring ourselves to speak. Finally, the voice stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across our faces. But the feeling of unease didn't fade. We stayed up all night, clutching our flashlights and staring into the mist, too afraid to sleep, afraid to even close our eyes. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we finally felt a sense of relief, though neither of us spoke. We packed up our gear in silence, our hands shaking as we broke down our tents and extinguished the fire. The morning mist had lifted, revealing the lake, still and quiet as ever. But the memory of that voice lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging reminder of the terror we'd felt. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I felt an odd urge to look back at the lake one last time. I turned, my heart pounding, and froze. Standing at the edge of the water, just beyond the reach of the trees, was a figure, a shadowy shape that looked exactly like me. It stood perfectly still, its face expressionless, watching us with dark, hollow eyes. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move as I stared at the figure, my own reflection twisted and wrong. It raised a hand, a mocking wave, as if to bid us farewell. I stumbled back, grabbing my cousin's arm and urging him to keep walking, my pulse racing with fear. As we disappeared into the trees, I heard it whisper my own voice back to me, soft and distorted, like a twisted echo. "Come back. I want to show you something." A few years ago, my friends and I planned a camping trip in a remote forest known for strange sightings and eerie folklore. The locals warned us about the woods, whispering about creatures and strange figures seen among the trees, but we brushed it off as small-town superstition. We were eager for a thrill, excited to prove the legends wrong. We set up camp just as the sun began to set, the sky fading from orange to purple as night crept in. The air was thick with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and a dense canopy of trees loomed over us, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. We built a fire, trying to shake off the odd sense of unease that settled over us as darkness fell. The stories began once the fire was crackling, our voices filling the silence as we laughed and tried to scare each other with tales of ghosts and monsters. But as the hours passed, our laughter faded, replaced by a strange tension that seemed to hang in the air. Even the firelight felt dimmer, its glow barely pushing back the darkness. Around midnight, I stepped away from the camp to use the bathroom. The forest was pitch black, the trees towering over me like silent giants. As I walked back toward the fire, I heard soft, quick footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank, but there was no one there. My heart began to race as I quickened my pace, the feeling of being watched prickling at my skin. When I returned to the camp, I found my friends staring into the woods, their faces pale and tense. "Did you hear it too?" one of them asked, his voice barely a whisper. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. Standing just beyond the firelight, half hidden in shadow, was a figure. A tall, thin shape with limbs that seemed too long, too stretched, like a shadow cast by something that wasn't quite human. Its face was a blank, pale blur, as if it was wearing a mask, and its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight in an eerie, yellowish hue. It stood perfectly still, watching us, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, almost like it was curious about us. For a moment, none of us moved, too terrified to look away. Then, the figure took a step forward, and in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar, it laughed. The sound was hollow and distorted, like someone mimicking a laugh but not quite getting it right. And then it began to speak, repeating our own words back to us, each phrase twisted and wrong, as if it was trying to understand the language but failing. "Come closer," it whispered in one of my friend's voices, beckoning with one spindly hand. Then it switched, mimicking another friend's laughter, its voice cycling through each of us, one after the other. "Come here," it repeated, shifting from voice to voice, mocking us. Its empty eyes locked on us with an unsettling intensity. We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled to our feet, grabbing our bags and flashlights, and ran, the creature's hollow laughter echoing behind us. It followed, its footsteps light and quick as if it was gliding over the ground, always just out of sight. I glanced back once, catching a glimpse of it slipping between the trees, its body moving with a sickening, jerky fluidity like a puppet on strings. We didn't stop until we reached the road, our breaths coming in panicked gasps as we huddled together, too afraid to go back, too shocked to speak. In the distance, at the edge of the woods, I saw it again, standing just beyond the tree line, watching us. Its face was still a pale, featureless blur, its eyes dark and empty, and as we stood there, I could have sworn I heard it whisper my own voice back at me, faint and mocking. Even now I can still hear that voice sometimes late at night, echoing through my mind like a broken record, calling me back to the darkness. And every so often, when I'm alone in the woods, I feel those empty eyes watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to come closer. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Remember to comment your video ideas down below.